Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into a collaborative beer, and specifically it's a collaboration between Interboro Spirits and Ales and Burial Beer Company. Interboro is based in New York. They are kind of the lead on this. This specific beer is called Alpine Style Pilsner. It is, of course, a Pilsner, 5% ABV on this one. So starting with label art, just a nice clean design. In fact, it looks rather reminiscent of many European brew style labels, so kind of cool. Alpine Style, of course, so let's get this cracked. I'm expecting that this is going to harken back to kind of a traditional German style Pils, which for my money is never a bad thing. This is poured right in the glass. All right. Yeah, that's forming a really nice head. I'm going to slow down the pour just a bit. Didn't quite get the whole thing in there. It is Pilsner. Pilsners are expected to form nice creamy heads, and this one absolutely did. Okay, visually, I can say this is a light beer, but it is much more akin to the color of, say, an IPA than it is a Pilsner. Pilsners tend to be a very, very pale yellow, kind of that straw yellow color. This has a bit more depth of color. Now, to me, that is suggesting that they kind of came up with their own kind of malt bill here, maybe threw in some that had a little more deep caramelization on them to extract some additional flavor. So I'll be quite curious to see how this affects the total kind of flavor profile of this Alpine Style Pils. Very, very active in terms of carbonation, super, super fine, tiny champagne-like bubbles, as expected in a Pils. So, looks great. The head formed beautifully. It's just a little darker than we expect to see on a Pils, but that's okay. Ought to be interesting. Let's give it a sniff. Okay. So that more or less smells like your standard Pilsner. It's got some very floral and fruity notes up front. It does smell very juicy, like almost like ripe, fresh cut apple and some pear in there. There's a little bit of underlying kind of grainy, baked good quality from the malt bill coming through, but it is dominant kind of fruit and floral. I'm not really picking up any sense of bitters. Obviously, they've probably gone the classic noble hop route. We will discover when we get in this, but it looks great. It smells great. Let's jump in for first sip. Ooh. Oh yeah, that's very nice. Okay, so I can say that this is not a pungently bitter Pilsner at all. It's very much more kind of focused on these underlying bright, fresh notes coming out of the malt bill. Where the bittering really does come into play, it's on the back end. It's not so much on the front. On the front, it does taste very fruit-like and very floral. So there's this combination that you smelled on the aroma of apples and peaches and kind of fresh flowers and things of that nature, a little bit of underlying graininess. That actually does translate in the glass very well. Specifically, it's kind of tasting like almost like a pie. If you took apples and pears and put them together in a pie and baked them for a long time, that's kind of what this tastes like, the bright kind of fruit essence coming out of it. After that kind of increases at the beginning and dials back its intensity, slowly the underlying kind of bitters start to creep in, and they do gradually intensify over about the next 20-30 seconds. It gets progressively more bitter, and that's really when you start to get kind of the underlying grain quality of the malt bill come through. So there is definitely this underlying sense of kind of toast and crumb that's coming through in this as well, but it's really tying to the bitters, which are not that prevalent up front, but very much come through a very gradual increase in intensity on the back end. So what you don't get up front, you do get on the back, and kind of vice versa. So at first I thought, yeah, this is not all that bitter at all, but it actually does have a pretty healthy amount of bitters that comes through. It just takes a while for it to intensify and get to that point. What they actually taste like, they're very much earthy bitters. There's no sense of juice or resin or tar or anything like that. It's very much classic kind of hop. So I am guessing they used a noble hop bill here. I couldn't find their hop list on this one, but I'm guessing that's what they used because that's the flavor profile coming through. Overall, very nice, very fresh. So I'm going to jump back in. I'm going to take another sip. I'm going to think on this body, this mouthfeel, and exactly what's happening texturally. See if anything else jumps out at me flavor-wise. Body on this one is medium light. It's got a little more heft to it than your average Pilsner. Mouthfeel feels very much like a Pilsner. It's mostly flat, just a little more resistant than water. Agitating around the palate, it does get quite creamy, so it feels very prototypical, other than the body has a little more heft to it, which is surprising for just 5% ABV. In terms of what happens on second sip of flavor intensification, really that's all that happens. It intensifies. It came through to me exact same order of operations, that kind of bright, fresh, ripe fruit that have been like baked in a pie, mixing with some undercurrents of floral notes. Then that starts to dial back. Then slowly, the bittering side of the hops start to open, as does this underlying grain quality. So overall, very nice. In terms of what happens on the end of the finish on this is impressively long. I probably should emphasize just how impressively intense the bittering grows over about 20-30 seconds after each sip. It just seems to keep going and going and going and intensifying and intensifying. It actually does get quite a distinct kind of bittering effect on the end of the finish here, which is significantly longer than average. And yes, this one does finish with a nice clean crisp finish, that classic kind of Pilsner drying of the palate. Overall, very, very nice. It's not what I expected on first sip. Took a lot longer to kind of develop its flavor profile than your average Pilsner. Overall, though, it tastes very, very nice. Flavor profile really does taste a lot like a German or a Czech Pilsner. I mean, they're calling it an Alpine Style. Yeah, I think they nailed it here. Very interesting Pilsner, very tasty Pilsner. I'm going to take my time, sip on this one, come up with my scores. When we come back, we'll get this beer ranked from top to bottom. All right, now that we've gotten to enjoy this beer, we're going to get it ranked. So this is a collaboration between Interboro Spirits Ales and Burial Beer Company. This is called Alpine Style Pilsner. It is, of course, a Pilsner. Clocks in at 5% ABV. Interboro Spirits Ales is based in Brooklyn, New York. So starting with the aroma. The aroma on this beer was nice. It smelled very much like your typical Pilsner, with some other interesting underlying notes and not quite as heavy on other specific notes. It was kind of high end of average for pungency, but you could tell it was a Pilsner at its heart. The aroma gets a 6 out of 10. For the taste on this beer was really, really nice. So there was a lot of interplay and different moving of various flavor characteristics, some very unique to this beer, but at its core, it was very much kind of a cross between a German and a Czech style Pilsner. It did have a lot of these subtle fruity overtones. It did have some very kind of classic maltiness to it, but this one obviously seemed like it had a little richer roast, so that kind of played into some different notes that came through in the malt bill. But overall, I really enjoyed the taste, and at its heart, it tasted like a very well done Pilsner. Taste gets a 10 out of 10. For the body, this was very much a light, medium light body as expected for a Pilsner in this ABV range. Body does get a 10 out of 10. For the mouthfeel, mouthfeel was essentially exactly what I expected. It did not feel particularly thick or viscous. You could feel the carbonation, the effervescence moving around the palate. When you agitated, it did get very creamy. That's exactly what I expected. Mouthfeel gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish on this beer was quite nice. It was very interesting in the way that the flavor profile developed and opened up, because at first I didn't think it had particularly heavy of a bitter profile, but all of kind of the fruity and the underlying kind of malt bill notes came up on the front, and then it progressively kind of blossomed and let those underlying bitters. And it tasted very much like they used kind of classic German and Czech noble hops, which I imagine is what they did use. Overall, very well put together. Finish was quite a bit longer than your average Pilsner, and it was quite enjoyable. The finish does get a 10 out of 10. For the head and retention, this one did a tremendous job, formed a nice thick creamy foamy head. That gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the appearance on this beer was nice. No denying it was a nice looking beer. But this was actually a pretty decent deviation away from the norm of a classic Pilsner, which is that pale straw yellow color. This obviously had some more deeply roasted malts added, which brought in a lot of interesting flavor characteristics. Before a Pilsner, it was a little out of the spectrum, still in it, but very much moving in a not the norm direction. Appearance overall above average, gets a 7 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was awesome. Everything that they put into the malt bill, and particularly, sure, it may have docked some points on appearance, but I think it paid dividends in the actual flavor profile of the beer. So they probably used some very classic Pilsner malts, but they also clearly had at least some amber, if not some Cara or Carapils in there. And it added, obviously, a deviation from the norm in terms of color, but what it brought to the table in terms of flavor profile was really, really interesting and unique. So you had a lot of these classic underpinnings, but then it had this completely separate character you don't normally get in a Pilsner. And that was balanced beautifully with the hops. At first I was like, oh, this is kind of off. It's nice, but it's off. But then as kind of the malt bill dialed back and did its thing and the hops really started to bloom, it was really, really quite fantastic. And it was clear that they knew what they were doing when they balanced their ingredients. Balance, I give a perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible, subjectively, I absolutely loved it. Gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Finally is an example of the style. So, this is a very nice Pilsner, and, you know, overall it did quite well. It lost a few points in a few kind of categories here. Nothing that really impactful, but in the grand scheme of what a Pilsner is, this is a little bit of an interesting twist. It's kind of an American craft. We're going to kind of do our own thing on this historic style. Overall, I think it kept the heart and soul of what a Pilsner is. It just tried some new interesting things. So overall example of the style, I did give it well above average, a 9 out of 10. Which brings the total score on Interboro Spirits Ales collaboration with Burial Beer, Alpine Style Pilsner, a 92 out of 100. So this was a very unique Pilsner. This is not like one I've had in the last couple of months. Very interesting. It kind of borrowed on some more maltier elements like you might find in a Märzen and kind of hybridized with the Pilsner back. You know, it was very nice, very enjoyable, very inventive. I'm hoping that I see some other brewers try to put their own twist on a classic Pilsner, because if this is the type of result, we need more of them in the marketplace. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, just turn on the notifications, click that bell icon. It is right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.